The storm had not yet arrived on the prairie, but inside the study of Marlowe Hall, the air already trembled. Leather and pipe smoke and centuries of varnish made the parlor smell like authority. A coal fire spat and shrank in the hearth. An untouched decanter of amber whiskey caught the lamplight. Above the mantel hung the stern oil portrait of the man who had built everything, a gaze that seemed to judge the present for its failures, the way a farmer judges a ruined field. At the window, the land rolled away in low, fenced waves. In every hollow and lonesome rise, 1,000 heads of cattle moved like slow punctuation marks under one name. Garrett Marlowe, cattle lord of 3 counties, paced with the slow, inexorable fury of a storm that had learned to be patient. His shoulders had the wide honesty of a life made of labor. His face had been hardened into something that did not invite argument. Behind him, like a shadow he could not quite cast off, his son stood hat in hand, boots still flecked with mud, jaw clenched against a future he had not chosen. "You think this is a question of love?" Garrett said, not turning. His voice was flat as iron. He struck a match, held it to the end of a cigar, and drew in a long, deliberate breath. "You will marry her. You will take her name into ours, or you will leave this house and never darken its doorstep again." Ethan Marlowe blinked. He had not asked if she was ugly. He had not even admitted to meeting her. But Garrett knew his son better than any man ever should, knew his vanity, his hope that a heart might still be allowed to govern decisions that had long ago been judged by cattle counts and acres. Ethan swallowed. He had spent 27 years learning to swallow his father's will, like bitter tincture. But this one lodged like a bone. "What if I won't?" he asked quietly. Garrett paused by the window. He could see in the waning light the thin black line of the Hartman boundary, 200 acres of hill and creek that had been the subject of his covetous map for decades. The last of the Hartmans had died the previous winter. Illness had taken them in a season of blizzards and empty pantries. Their daughter, Lydia Hartman, held the deed. That deed would make the Marlowe spread, contiguous and whole. Garrett's jaw hardened. "You think I'm bluffing?" he said. "No men of the Marlowe line were ever soft when land was to be had. You have 1 week. Marry her, give her name to our name, and the Hartman acres fold into Marlowe Holdings. Or you walk out now, and you are no son of mine." Ethan's mouth closed on a dozen comebacks. He saw for a flicker the face of his mother, the time she had smoothed the collar of his childhood shirts and told him that pride was a good thing only when it could be fed. He had never stood against his father before, not in the way a man must to be more than a thing to carry on a name. Outside, the sky darkened like a closing lid. Thunder rolled. Far off, as if the land itself were making the slow decision to take sides. The Hartman homestead crouched on its ridge like an old dog waiting for a fire to come. Paint flaked from the shutters. The porch sagged, but the structure's bones were stubborn, rough-hewn and true, built to hold up to Colorado winters and to the grief that hollows out families. Ethan rode up the lane with his pack light, 3 shirts, a suit his mother had kept pressed, and a Bible whose dog-eared pages smelled of church pews and lullabies. He rode with a stomach like a clenched fist and a head full of questions he did not dare voice. The door opened before he had a chance to knock. She stood framed in the threshold, a woman in sensible gray, hair pulled back as if it refused to take part in any frivolity. Up close, he saw a face that would not be flattered into prettiness. It was honest, practical, the sort that showed the map of weather and work. Not the kind of face men wrote songs about, yet not plain in a way that missed the gravity of presence. Her eyes were what stayed with him, clear, unblinking, unforgiving of pretense. "You must be Ethan Marlowe," she said, blunt and measured. "Mr. Hartman," he began, then corrected himself, remembering the instructions he'd been given to bear a new name. "Ethan Marlowe," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that suddenly felt like an old affectation. "Call me Lydia," she said. "We're not in the mood for formalities. Reverend Keene will be here at 2. He'll get it done as quick as the law allows. Coffee?" She stepped aside and ushered him into a home that smelled faintly of lavender soap and of the absence of people who used to fill rooms. The interior felt like a house paused mid-breath, furniture draped in sheets, surfaces swept after a grief more intimate than visitors could perceive. Lydia moved with an economy of motion honed by necessity, pour, stir, set. She handed him a chipped mug without the softness he half expected, and the awkwardness between them became an invisible object they handled with careful propriety. "You could refuse," she said, and she said it as if it were a fact about fences and wells. "So could you," he replied, her face stiffened for the slightest moment. "Not with men like your father," she said. "Property is easy to take from a woman alone. They do not call it charity, they call it logistics." It stung that he could not deny it. Garrett Marlowe had watched the Hartman fields for more than a decade, like a predatory weather vane waiting for the wind to favor him. Ethan thought of what it would mean, marrying at his father's behest, signing a contract for a life that was not of his design. But the idea of leaving without the land felt like abandoning the possibility of building anything of his own. At 2, the Reverend Josiah Keene, a man who had married 3 generations of local families, arrived with his Bible tucked under, his arm in an expression that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. The ceremony took 7 minutes. Lydia wore her mother's old dress, altered at the seams to fit better than sorrow. Ethan buttoned a suit that felt borrowed and hollow. They exchanged vows and signatures like men and women trading receipts for a legal transaction. And when the Reverend offered blessings, they felt more like condolences than benedictions. After he left, the house settled back into the suspicion of silence. Ethan announced he would take the spare room upstairs. Lydia showed him a narrow staircase and a quilted bed. "Supper time," she said. Practicalities resumed their throne. In the weeks that followed, the marriage operated like a machine, 2 separately occupied territories within the same walls. Lydia rose early to feed hens, to milk the cow, to scrub the pans. Ethan handled fence mending and the rougher, heavier edges of ranch work. They ate together when the sun slid low, conversations limited to weather, fence posts, and which cattle were worth more than others. It was manageable. It was tolerable. It held until the night the sky itself seemed to ignite. He woke to the scent of smoke and the scream of startled horses. From his window, he saw a line of fire moving like a predatory thing across the dry grass, fed by 3 months without rain and a wind that behaved as if it bore a grudge. Flames licked the eastern pasture, edging toward the barn where winter hay slept in carefully stacked silence. "Lydia!" he pounded at her door. "Fire! The pastures!" She was at his side before he finished the sentence, a white shift under her jacket and the steadiness of a life spent answering alarms before breakfast. They moved as people who had rehearsed losses and would not be undone by them. Ethan yanked fence wires, turned the horses loose toward the creek to keep them from being trapped in fences. Lydia dug trenches, threw water, shouted instructions like a captain on a deck. The blaze crested the hill like a living wall and turned night into inferno. Heat hit them like a fist. They soaked the eaves and the porch with what little water a tired pump could offer, until their arms burned and their lungs filled with grit. When the fire finally passed, the barn was a black skeleton. The fence was half gone. The hay that would have kept them through winter was ash. They sat on the stoop at dawn, hands blistered and hair streaked with soot. Lydia's face, gritty with smoke, looked suddenly luminous against the ruin. She squeezed his hand once, a quick private pressure that wordlessly said, "You stayed." "Why did you stay?" she asked. "Most men would have ridden with their pockets full. Most men would have let us burn and counted the acres instead of the animals." "Because this is my home now too," he said. The words fell into the cold air and settled, for the first time, like a small building block rather than a command. From that night, the house stopped being merely a place where 2 inconvenient names were bound. The shared work that began as endurance softened into partnership. They patched fences together, counted the animals in brutally honest ledger entries, and cooked meals that grew longer at the table. The presence between them shifted from legal to something like affection, quiet, patient, responsible. When the county harvest fair rolled into town, bright with banners and apple pies and the bustle of people determined to forget winter for an afternoon, Lydia nearly refused to go. She had learned to move through town under other people's eyes, the eyes that weighed and judged and often decided futures with a look. Ethan asked her to come, not ordered, but asked as a man might ask a neighbor to share a load. "There's a prize bull up for auction," he said. "It wouldn't hurt to see breeding stock." She hesitated, then agreed. She put on the blue silk she had been saving for weddings and social calls and pinned her hair down to say, "I will hold my head up." They walked the main street together, heads turned, chatter dwindled, passers-by measured them with the small, practiced cruelty reserved for the brides and widows of the world. Mrs. Marlowe, Beatrice Lang, an elegant woman with the practiced sharp smile of a social thermometer, cooed as if measuring a newly minted ornament. "How splendid to see you looking so... get back." Beatrice's remarks were punctuated with the implication that Lydia was charity, an inconvenience Garrett Marlowe had accepted to fold a patch of earth into his kingdom. Lydia answered with a steady politeness that contained an edge. "We're rebuilding," Ethan said before she could lie. "Insurance will cover most of it, and Lydia's been keeping the books. We'll be fine." It was the first time Ethan defended her in public, and whatever warmth had been slow burning between them warmed a bit more at hearing it given voice. Lydia appreciated it, not with grand gestures, but with a small, private gratitude that became visible in the way she rested her hand on his forearm. Spring gave way to a winter that struck like a judge. They rebuilt the barn, they replaced fence lines, they stacked hay again. Life settled into the rhythm of people who had chosen to endure rather than run. Then Garrett visited. He arrived on a night when the snow had made the world soft and silent. The knock came, a heavy, deliberate sound that announced him long before he stepped into the kitchen. He smelled of tobacco and old money. He carried, folded in his hand, a paper that thudded with the threat of a new future. "My lawyers drew this up," Garrett said. He set the document on the table with the kind of theatricality that was intended to humiliate. The railroad needed a right-of-way through the valley. The company was willing to pay generously. "It's reasonable," Garrett said. "You could take the money and buy better. Lands, start fresh somewhere softer." Lydia stared at the contract. $50,000, a sum that sounded like the answer to any problem presented by life in that era. California, gentler winters, a land where fences did not bend into ruin each summer. Ethan looked at her and saw a map of possibility flash through her features. Fear, hope, grief, longing. Lydia rose slowly and put both hands on the table. "This land is the story of my family," she said. "My grandfather cleared those fields with his own hands. My father fought claim jumpers and rail negotiators and men who thought land could be taken by desire. My mother planted the apple tree by the kitchen. She baked pies from those apples every spring and called them her reward for surviving the winters. I could take your money, Mr. Marlowe. I could walk away with coin enough, but I'd be carrying ghosts the size of mountains." Ethan felt the old Marlowe hunger for acres ripple briefly in his chest. He had been raised on maps and succession plans. He had been bred to prioritize legacy. But there was something in Lydia's voice, a steady, fierce allegiance to the past, that shifted him. "Then we fight," he said simply. "We do this our way." 3 days later, they rode together to meet the railroad survey crew, 3 somber men in stiff coats who looked at prairie wind and thought of timetables. Their leader, Mr. Whitmore, had the calm, officious air of a man accustomed to making things happen by the force of paperwork. "My company needs this strip," he told them. "It's public good. Eminent domain is a well-known tool. We'll make life easier for you if you cooperate." Lydia's answer was exquisite and terrifying in its simplicity. She explained that public good must, in the law's eyes, outweigh private injury. She explained that a legal battle would be costly, and that sometimes railroads preferred a negotiated path rather than a courthouse fight. Her words were not damage control, they were warning. She had rebuilt a barn with her hands and refused to give away the bones of her family's life because men in suits decided it was convenient. Mr. Whitmore packed his gear and rode off with a muttered assessment about stubbornness. They knew the railroad could come back. They knew the company could invoke the law. They did not know if the cost of court would be enough to make them reconsider. They spent the following months organizing, learning what the law permitted, speaking to county clerks, writing letters, and gathering neighbors whose land lay along the valley. And in the doing, the marriage that had begun as a transaction crystallized into something else. It was not glamour or fireworks. It was late-night arguments about strategy, hands warm over the same ledger, cups of coffee shared in a kitchen that had become theirs. Ethan discovered he loved Lydia's stubborn mind. Lydia discovered she liked the way Ethan could be gentle with animals and absolute with land thieves. They joked quietly about a future neither of them had had the right to imagine a year before. When the railroad finally decided to route around the Hartman Ridge rather than through it, Garrett called his son and spoke in tones that suggested grudging acknowledgement. He would not apologize for the way he'd tried to seize what others had. But he told Ethan, in the curt, manly rhetoric he knew, that he admired stubbornness when it was profitable. It was not an embrace, nor was it ever meant to be. It was a concession. Spring came back to the valley as if reclaimed. Lydia shelled peas at the kitchen table, and pie crusts once again left flour ghosts on the counter. Ethan rode the pastures with new energy. He had not only kept land, but reclaimed a sense of self. In years to come, they built a life on the marginal soil and turned it into something that fed more than their bellies. It fed a family's pride, a community's dignity, and the sort of small, private faith that grows quietly between two people who choose to put the work in. Their love was not the bright, sudden flame of ballads. It was slower, the hearth-fire kind that has to be fed in winter and tended during storms. It was a love built of shared vigilance and the steady kindness of morning coffee poured for someone who has already risen. It was the small intimacies of a life that had been handed to them by duty and then gently, stubbornly claimed as their own. If you liked this retelling, if it moved you even a little, share it with someone who loves stories of grit and slow-grown love. Leave a note about which character surprised you the most. If you want more frontier rewrites and fresh characters carved from the same hard earth, tell me which scene you'd like expanded or adapted next. Want this as a printable, beautifully formatted PDF to gift or save? Say the word and I'll prepare it for you. Your voice keeps stories like these living. Share, comment, and let me know what you'd like to read next.